how to work and learn in self-isolation. This is part of our Teaching Thursdays webinar series for the next several weeks. I'm your host, Stuart Creek, a marketing manager at Simplilearn. And my guest today is a human resources executive, Miriam Veiss-Creque. A bit more about her in a moment, but first a few notes on how to participate in the webinar. At the controls at the bottom of your screen, the speech bubble will call up the chat window. You'll be able to enter a comment for the host and the presenter in the next window, the text window. And remember to hit the send button. One of us will try to respond during the presentation. You should also use the Q&A function to direct questions for Miriam. If you don't have a question mark button, use the three dots button and you'll then be able to access Q&A, and we'll collect your questions and get to as many as we can in the Q&A session toward the end of the webinar. We're also going to poll you for some information a few times in the webinar, and I'd like to start that now with two questions. What is your current job role, and how are you feeling today? And that would be on a scale of thumbs up, in the middle, or thumbs down. So you have the opportunity to answer both questions, please. Thumbs up is I'm feeling great. In the middle is things are okay. And thumbs down means that things could be better. I'm going to give you about another 30 seconds or so to answer the poll. And you have about 15 seconds left to get your answer in. And we can see that the greatest number of you fall in the other professional or other category in terms of your roles. And it's nice to see that most of you are feeling okay today, or even better than okay. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce Miriam Veiss-Creque. Miriam is the Manager of Academic Affairs and Human Resources at Stanford University School of Medicine's Department of Ophthalmology. Prior to transitioning to human resources, Miriam was a community college instructor and academic and career counselor with over 10 years of experience working with adult learners in both traditional and remote settings. Welcome, Miriam. I think I'll unmute you, Miriam.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Great. Thank you so much, Stuart. I'm so happy to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit of information with everyone.
Great. So let's start with a question that people have been struggling with for a number of weeks now. What challenges arise for people who have to work during self-isolation?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it's definitely one that I've been addressing a lot in my role in human resources. The biggest thing right now we see are changes to your actual work environment. So unless you were prior to this working 100% remote, this is a major change for most people. You're not in the office anymore. You might not be with your colleagues. There's a physical separation that we're used to between our workspace and our home life, and that no longer exists. Additionally, you might not have access to the same resources that you're used to having. For example, I'm going to have to pop over to my own office today because I need to FedEx some documents in to a state regulator board, and I don't have FedEx, I don't have a printer at home. And so all of these things are different from what we're used to. Also, depending on your living situation, you might be dealing with a lack of a dedicated workspace. For some people, we have maybe a spare room in the home, or we have somewhere that we can set up a desk and have our dedicated workspace through this process. But for some people, you might not have that. Depending on your living situation, you might have interruptions from family members. Right now, you might even have your children having to do distance learning. And so you're actually having to both be a worker and a teacher at the same time. And there's also sometimes environmental distractions. I know for myself, my office room in my home, I have a window that faces into my neighbor's yard. And the other day we had a big town hall meeting that I was hosting at work, and my neighbor started having an argument. And so, I have to be very mindful, right, of the environmental distractions that may exist when I'm hosting some sort of, learning opportunity or otherwise working from home.
Is a cat an environmental distraction or a family member?
Well, so that depends on how you see it, but I absolutely, we have pets, most of us, and so in our department, every now and then on our Zoom calls, someone hops up into someone's lap, or you look over and there's a tail coming into the screen. And so, yes, even things like your pet, sometimes your cat jumps up on that keyboard. There's a video going around right now. A woman was in her meeting and her cat jumped on her head. So definitely a different set of circumstances than we may be used to. The other big factor that we see going on right now is that we're being asked to work during basically a crisis. This isn't a construction project that maybe you're asked to work remotely for a short period because of something going on like construction or something transient that you understand. We're dealing with a very real existential threat, so to speak. There's a public health crisis going on. For those of us who are still working, we're being asked to kind of, so to speak, keep calm and carry on. But there's major changes in how we're asked to work and how we're asked to operate in our lives. I know here, I live in California, and we just enacted a rule where I now have to wear a mask when I go into any public store. And so that's a very different kind of way of living that I'm used to. And so being asked to continue to work and be productive during this time, it can be really challenging. The other thing going on is that people we may know are being impacted differently. And so this can really impact our interpersonal relationships with work. I have a colleague whose grandmother passed away because of COVID. And so, interacting with her has been different the last few days than it would be in a normal situation. We have people who are immune compromised. And so their concern level is much different. I had a colleague reach out to me recently with a frustration, and I am in human resources, so that happens. And she was frustrated because one of our colleagues has been a little bit hard to communicate with lately. He hasn't been as available to her. And we had a conversation about how he has two small children at home and he's having to adjust to a much different set of circumstances than those of us who don't have children or who have a different setup. And so we were able to kind of talk about creative ways that we can effectively collaborate with each other while we're dealing with these different circumstances, and to be very mindful that everyone's at a different place.
Yeah, I mean, it's different if you're used to face interactions. We'll get to that in a little bit too.
Absolutely. And one of the things going on right now that we want to be very aware of, and of course, with a background in psychology, I'm always thinking about these things when I'm working with people. We're asked to be productive in the face of a pandemic. And there's this idea of a continuum, right, that we're all on with how we're processing and coping with the information. So when you ask yourself, who do I want to be during COVID-19, if we're going to just use that as a general term, you may have seen this shared on other social media platforms. But what we're looking at is this continuum about, are people in a fear zone, learning zone, or growth zone? So if you're in a fear zone, if you're actively in fear, it's very hard to be effective at your work because your emotions are not in check. You might be feeling very panicked. You might feel like you have to share a lot of information to make sure everyone has access to that information. You might start doing things like shopping for food or other supplies that you might not normally shop for. I know for those of you who are not from the United States, maybe you're not going through the great toilet paper shortage that we all are going through. But fear is really something that makes it difficult to be cognitively engaged with your work. It makes it hard to think critically and problem solve. The next into, we've been in about 6 weeks of, as we're calling it, shelter in place in California. It's called self-isolation or quarantine in other places. So we see a lot of people are now in this learning zone. They're trying to kind of evaluate the information that they're sharing. They're being more mindful of their colleagues and their friends and how they're feeling. They're being more mindful of themselves. They're starting to give up the idea of having to control everything. And then the further zone that we see that we want people to get into, for the most effective kind of processing would be a growth zone. And this is where you can really start to feel things like gratitude, to look for ways to adapt to new changes. And this is where, especially within the work sphere, really understanding that being adaptable, being flexible, all of those things come when you're more able to cope with things like trauma, like fear. And so I want everyone to kind of take a moment and sort of think about, where are you currently? And maybe think about, the people that you work with directly and from your interactions, where they might be as well.
That's a great graphic, by the way. Um, so you didn't have to go back. So how do you maintain a work routine while you're in self-isolation? Well, we're sitting at home. We don't really have our coworkers and supervisors around us. What are your tips for that?
Yeah, that's really an important point, that when you're in a different realm, when you're working from home and you don't have your supervisor right there, or maybe, the same kind of structure you're used to, creating that for yourself is going to be key to maintaining a sense of normalcy and to be able to maintain the same kind of effective, productive workflow that you're used to. I cannot stress enough how important it is not to neglect your physiological needs during this time. We talk about this a lot in the workplace as it is. We have to talk to people about things like making sure you're taking breaks, making sure you're eating meals, leaving work on time. The best mentor I have ever had in my career was someone who, at the end of the day, would force me to leave my office, because if she was leaving, she knew I didn't need to be there. And so really creating that structure and scheduling for yourself, that's going to be key, again, to maintaining that sense of normalcy with work. You cannot be as effective a worker if you're not nourishing yourself, if you're not taking breaks, both for physical needs, getting up from your computer, stretching a little bit, resting your eyes. I work in the ophthalmology department. Please don't neglect your eyes while you're taking this work from home time, but also creating those boundaries with your work time.
Yeah, I find that you know, I will get very low blood sugar if I forget to eat lunch, and it happens quite a lot while I'm in this situation. So
Yeah, one of my big things that I've worked on with both myself and my team, we're all kind of very similar to each other, is we don't have a good habit of taking lunch breaks away. And so this year we actually had set some wellness goals, and for 3 of us, our wellness goals were to take lunch away from our desks. And so as we've been in this work from home space, one of the things we do is we chat with each other on an inter-office messaging tool, and we'll talk about that soon. But we talk to each other. Are you taking, a lunch break? What did you have for lunch today? Are you going to have breakfast this morning? Did you make your cup of coffee? Have you had enough water even? And it's really funny. You would think, working from home, your kitchen's right there, the sink's right there. I have to be a lot more mindful with myself, because I am at home. I am more comfortable and relaxed. And it's hard to remember that, oh yeah, this is my work day. And maybe around, noon, 1 o'clock, it would be a good idea to eat a midday meal. So being very mindful that your needs aren't going to change just because your environment has changed per se. The other big
mhm.
aspect of maintaining this work routine is the idea of designating a workspace that's as separate as possible from your living spaces. So, one thing we talk about a lot in behavioral psychology is something called state dependent learning. It's this idea that you will perform a task better if you can perform that task in the same state or environment in which you learn to do it. And so a lot of us actually learn to do our jobs probably in the same area that we work. I know that, I was at my desk learning to do my job when I was getting onboarded, and I've moved offices, but I'm in the same building. I go to the same place every morning. Even driving to work, it puts my brain into that work mode. It's an activity that signifies to me that I'm going to work. So I do recommend that while you're working from home, you try to establish a workspace that you don't use for other purposes as much as possible. So for me, I was very fortunate that I have a guest bedroom. I've converted it into an office and I only use it for work. I don't, take naps in here. I don't come in here for anything else but work right now. And that helps me to keep it separate. For people who don't have that option to have a whole separate space or room, it can be important to do little things like to try to create a ritual at the beginning of your work time. So, for example, if you have to sit at the family dining table to do work because it's the only surface on which you can set up your workspace, maybe bring some of your little knickknacks that you might have at your desk or pictures of your colleagues or something like that, or even maybe choose some sort of song or transitional activity that you do when you start work to really help you to create that boundary around that space as workspace, at least during your work time.
That's a great point. The delineation or demarcation between your own time and your work time is so hard to maintain right now. It's so
Yeah,
important.
with technology, I think it's become harder to maintain even, before this was happening, the fact that we can text each other, right? That's huge. We've had people talk to me in human resources. I've had people come up to me and say, hey, do I have to share my cell phone number, with some of the faculty that we work with? Or do I have to give my cell phone number, to my manager, for example? And we've had conversations about, what's appropriate to ask people to do as far as, sharing their personal contact information, because this idea that we need to be available 24/7, it's very disruptive to an actual ability to do work life balance. But technology makes it so much easier to access people that at this time, when people know that we're at home, and it's not like you can say, well, I'm in my car commuting. We want to be especially mindful to hold our own boundaries and also to be respectful of others.
Hmm.
So, some considerations when you're setting up your remote workspace, they're very similar to the same considerations that we would take setting up any workspace for someone on site. Ergonomics are really key to maintaining physiological health in the workspace. And so it's really vital that you and your company take precautions to ensure that you're not going to have an inappropriate setup in your home workspace that's going to lead to a long-term physical problem. That's when workers' compensation becomes an issue. So things like, your posture, the level of your screens, having screens big enough to read from, those are really important things to maintain. The same things that you would want at your desk at work, you want to try to replicate as much as possible within your workspace. I know that
Yeah.
my team was very lucky that we actually did have some construction that was about to happen the week before we went into our shelter in place. And so we actually had already taken home our monitors, our docking stations. We knew we wouldn't be in the office for at least 12 weeks. And so we set up remote workstations really effectively in our home spaces. But one of the things we did have to do was take on a little bit of cost to the department to make sure that we had things like laptop stands. Someone needed a wrist rest. Someone needed a fan for their laptop to not overheat. Little things like that to ensure everyone can continue to work effectively.
Yeah. My wife transitioned to work from home and in preparation bought a nice office chair for home and found out when she started doing the work that it was not comfortable at all. And so she literally went back to her desk in her office and grabbed her ergonomic chair, brought that
Mhm.
home, and it made a
Yeah,
huge difference for her.
absolutely. I my own chair story is that I lived in Hawaii for almost a year, a couple years ago, and while I was there, I bought a really nice office chair for myself because I was, doing a lot of work at home. And I ended up moving back to California kind of unexpectedly when I was offered a job at Stanford. And I had to think about it, but I packed up that office chair and I shipped it because it was so comfortable and I didn't want to have to buy a new one. So, the seating that we have at work, especially if you're someone at a computer, it really does impact how you feel at the end of the day. The hardest thing I think for me is that I don't have a standing desk at home and we have standing desks at work. And so I've had to really remind myself, because I don't have that option to stand at my desk, I have to take breaks to go and stand and get out of my chair. Uh,
Hmm.
The other considerations that you need to have are lighting. I don't think a lot of us realize how different industrial lighting is from our home lighting until we really have that moment, I think. And so if your workspace is near a source of natural light, like windows, that's one of the best ways to have lighting because you'll get not only the nice natural light, but the effect on your mental health. There's a strong connection between natural sunlight exposure and feelings of depression. There's an inverse correlation there. And also it helps to maintain your circadian rhythms, which have to do with when you sleep and wake and your eating cycles. Human beings have a natural circadian rhythm to be awake during the light period of time of the day and to sleep during the dark. And so if you don't have enough light in your home space, it can start to mess with your sleep. You also want to be really mindful, again, working in ophthalmology, can't stress enough, your eyes will suffer if you're not having appropriate lighting, and that includes if you're looking at screens in a dark room that aren't appropriate to the lighting. So you really want to make sure that you're avoiding overly straining your eyes. Lighting is just also something that can really affect the mood of the room. And so one of the things to think about is if you're doing something like a video call, right, to think about how the lighting is hitting you.
Yeah. As an amateur filmmaker, I started noticing when we started doing more Zoom and WebEx calls that the lighting at my home workspace causes a glare on my face, and it's been, just really a lot of trouble to try to fix that.
Yeah, it's really interesting with the amount of work that we're doing via Zoom and having video conferences. We've all started to look at the little tips and tricks. Like there's a Zoom function that touches up your appearance so it looks a lot softer. But yeah, it's definitely important the light not only for when you're just working in the space, but also correct when you're on a Zoom call. If you're fading in and out of being able to be seen because the lighting is shifting, I recommend taking at least 5 minutes before any video conference, especially if it's one, if you're just video conferencing with your team, a couple of us will, be in our pajamas in the morning drinking our coffee. But if you have a client or you're video conferencing with leadership in your team or your department, you want to maybe take 5 minutes to ensure that you look appropriate on camera, that the lighting is appropriate, that there's nothing in the background that you wouldn't want seen. For example, I have a whiteboard on which I track promotion activity for faculty. And I realized that where I'd placed it in my home office, it was directly behind me on Zoom calls. And so luckily I moved it before my first Zoom call because I realized that everyone does not need to see that information. So the other thing thinking about you're setting up your home office is your decor. So like I said, you want to be really mindful of what's visible if you have video calls, but you also want to think about what would you have in your normal workspace. If you have pictures of your family in your normal workspace, well, maybe you don't need them because they're right there, your family right now while you're working from home. But maybe you have a picture of your office mates. Maybe you have, some sort of artwork that you would have in your office and you were able to take home. I know that, again, I set up, as much as possible, the exact same things I had on my desk at work, I set up at home, and it's really helped with that transitional space. It's also just, things that bring joy to you. One of my big things is I keep trinkets from my own travel as well as presents I've gotten from other people when they travel. And those things help to remind me of kind of the normal times that we'll get back to eventually, and to really focus on not just getting stuck in this place of how weird everything is, but reminding myself that this is a weird part of life that's going to be transient and move forward from this.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good thing to keep in mind.
Yes.
So then, as we've talked about, you're at home, you're in your personal space, you've got work, uh, in a sense, intruding into that space, and boundaries are really important. So, how do you create that work life balance during self isolation?
Sure. And it's funny because I've had this discussion with my director before, and we talk about how we really don't usually like to use the term work life balance. We tend to use the term work life integration in our department and in our conversations. But at this time, I actually feel like work life balance is a more appropriate term for what's going on right now, because what we're trying to do is balance those two different aspects of ourselves that are now kind of interwoven, not in a way that is ideal. So I definitely recommend you find substitutions for your usual activities that may have been disrupted. One of my friends and I go to the gym every week together, and we haven't been able to do that. And the first few weeks, I definitely was not in a place where I was, ready to get back up on trying to figure out how to maintain an exercise routine. But one of the things that we've talked about is if your gym is closed, that there's all these streaming workout platforms right now. And so we created a department Pinterest board that we all share with each other, where we can share the different resources we're using, both for exercise, but also for activities for those of us with children, different recipes to try, different self-care tips. And so finding substitutions for things you would usually do. If you usually would go, to the salon and maybe have, a pedicure and a manicure and get a haircut, or if you would usually go out with friends and, maybe go for a walk around the park, look at ways to do similar things that are different. Maybe you go for a walk by yourself, but you video chat with a friend while they're also walking by themselves. Or maybe you look up a recipe for a home face mask that you can do to kind of pamper yourself. It's important, like we discussed, sticking to your normal work schedule and creating those boundaries around your work hours. This is a really big topic of debate, I think, for some people. I am a proponent of not taking work calls after hours, and now that is short of actual emergencies. If somebody calls me and somebody fell down at work and it's after my hours, but there's a workers' compensation issue, of course I'm going to take that call. That's totally, understandable. But if you wouldn't normally be there to answer the phone on a work day, if it wouldn't be an expectation normally for you to be available to people, it's not really reasonable to expect that just because now you've shifted to working from home, that you're also going to shift the boundaries of your work time. So, it depends on the company, it depends on the service you're providing, it depends on things like whether you're working with people internationally or not. But I do think that it's important to continue to have boundaries. And I think that leadership can be so instrumental in setting that expectation that, if I, as a manager in my department, am sending emails at like 2 in the morning and my, team wakes up and they see that I was up that late doing these things, they might think that's something that they need to replicate. So I also think it's very important for leadership to, kind of set the tone and the expectations that people are expected to continue to be able to have boundaries around their work. And finally, finding leisure activities and maintaining connection with others. I can't stress enough that this is not a normal time for anyone. This is not anything that almost any of us have lived through, really. And so maintaining connection is such a vital key to human functioning. If you were used to doing things like having game nights with your friends, consider if there's a virtual option to do that. Providing yourself with a sense of connection and community right now can be really the difference between feeling isolated and just having to kind of physically be isolated. Even things like Facebook groups, you can find that sense of community. There's one that I'm in right now that's just about how we're all coping with things, and we share, funny things, but also different resources and tips. And it really helps you to remember that you're not in this alone.
Yeah, the human connection is so really important and so difficult to keep in mind when you're at home, working all day, and don't have those cues from people around you.
Yeah, it's difficult, and I live by myself, and so one of the big things for me has been adjusting. I used to go out 3, 4 times a week with friends or have someone over for dinner, things like that. And so really for me, the biggest thing has been just continuing to stay connected to my friends. Later tonight, I have a virtual game night that I'm going to be doing with some friends, and that's been just really a wonderful way for us to, not feel like our whole lives had to be put, to a halt, but we can continue just in a different way.
Yeah. So as we talk about maintaining that connection, what tools uh, do you find most useful?
Sure. I think that that's important to look at kind of two different areas right now when we're talking about connection. There's both the connections at work and there's connections in your personal life. I'd like to continue to kind of maintain like that there is a difference between the two. So for at work, teleconferencing and messaging tools are absolutely the keys to success for my team. We have Zoom and Slack are the two main tools that we use. And at a minimum, we do one weekly face-to-face Zoom for my team. I manage 3 people. And then we ensure that throughout the week, if there's questions that someone has, or if there's something that comes up, that I always offer the option to do a Zoom if they'd rather just speak face to face and maybe share their screen and like, go over the thing together, versus if they want to just have a phone call or just type it out, via Slack. Having that face to face connection is, it really, it makes a difference when you can see someone's face while they're speaking to you. You can see kind of emotional responses. And again, just as human beings, it reminds us that there's still people out there. We can maintain that connection and sense of cohesion. Um,
Yeah, we've noticed, on that point though, Miriam, we've noticed that in our own work team, we do a twice weekly team check-in, and our manager has set a policy now for at least one of those to have the cameras on so that we can get that, more human connection.
Yeah, our department chair is really big on having camera on as much as people are, able to in faculty meetings, in team meetings. I had to pop down to my office the other day to pick up some paperwork, and the department chair was there, and he and I chatted for a few minutes from 10 feet away, and it was really surprising how nice it felt just to be able to see him in person and talk to him a little. And we text, we Slack, we Zoom with each other, but seeing someone in person is so different. And so whatever you can do to kind of maintain that sense of human connection during work time is really advisable. Um, for things like, of course, having to collaborate, from remote places, that's kind of not changed much for my own department because we already were using a lot of file sharing and cloud tools. A lot of what we do involves, documents or forms having to go through several processes and reiterations, and one person has to fill this out, then the other has to review and approve. And so using these cloud tools allows you to continue to share and edit your documents. Your collaboration doesn't have to come to a halt. And I also really appreciate, for me, the big thing is a lot of these tools have built-in accountability. I think one of the biggest challenges that I had when I first heard that we were having to go into this remote working, and again, for me, it was actually before the shelter in place, I'd heard that I had to do it for construction. I was really starting to be concerned about how I was going to manage a new team member that I've brought on recently, who's still very much in training, and having that built-in accountability where I can see when she went in to edit something, I can see the changes she made. They're all tracked within our Box system or Google Drive system. That has allowed us to really continue the training in a very effective way because I can pinpoint where there might have been a misstep, or I can find, here's where the document, here's the last iteration where it was correct. Let's go back to this version. So really using those tools that allow you to collaborate and still maintain accountability are really vital. I do, however, recommend that for your personal life, when possible, you try to use something different. We're going to bring up that idea of boundaries again. If you're always on Zoom during your workday and then you go into a Zoom, virtual hangout with your friends, you can actually literally feel like you're in another meeting. And so Zoom fatigue is something that people talk about. If you have FaceTime or Facebook Messenger and you can chat with your friends on those, that might be a better tool. You can use some fun filters. You can make it a little more fun and interactive, especially if you have children and they're maybe Zooming with cousins, chatting with cousins or with grandparents. Those things like FaceTime, Facebook Messenger, cute little filters can be a way to add a little bit of fun to these conversations with our loved ones. Again, Zoom is very business-like. I WebEx business-like. It's difficult sometimes to break away from that sense of being at work if you're using the same tools in your personal life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So at this point, I'd like to take a break in the conversation and ask the audience another question. And this time it's what digital skills do you currently use in your work? We'll give you a couple of minutes to answer the poll. And when we continue the conversation with Miriam, we'll be talking about learning and upskilling. So we'd like to get an assessment of what your skill level is currently or what your repertoire is currently. And then you can think as we're talking about how you'd like to fill in any gaps or expand it. And give you about 30 seconds more to complete the poll. Okay. You have about 15 seconds to get your answers in and hit submit. And so it's, I think, interesting that of all of the skills people bring to this conversation today, the most common is project management. And that probably means you're also involved in leading teams. And we'll be talking a little bit about that, I think, in our conversation. So let's go ahead, Miriam. So the question here is, how can you take advantage of this time you have in self-isolation to make space for personal growth and education? And the common concept or the meme that's going around is, now that I have the time, I'm going to write a great novel or become a wonderful singer or something. And how do you actually go ahead in this particular time? How would you advise people to make space to actually do that personal growth?
Sure. The one I keep hearing is that was it Isaac Newton developed calculus during the plague or something. So what's your excuse? And it's like, oh, great, more pressure, wonderful. I think a big consideration that we all have to think about is that advancing our slide. Distance learning is becoming the norm. And what I mean by that is that we previously had a system in which people never really thought about distance learning in a lot of situations. They never had an online class or a blended class. They didn't have to self-pace. They didn't have to, go into an online lecture series or something. And so with distance education, distance learning becoming the norm now, where everyone's kind of becoming exposed to it, there's this unique opportunity, this kind of meta opportunity to become a really effective and self-disciplined remote worker or remote learner. I used to work with a lot of adult students that would be returning to degree programs or to school or to higher education after many years out. And we really had to talk about being an adept, self-directed learner, because the programs they were in were often blended. They weren't self-paced, they were very structured, but you weren't coming into a class every week like you would traditionally. You were coming in maybe once a month and doing the rest of your coursework online. So really becoming adept at self-directed learning, this is a skill that you can cultivate. It's not, a trait that someone's born with. It's a set of skills that you can learn, you can cultivate, you can get better at it. Part of that is going to be about setting realistic goals. You want to account for both your actual time available and your mental resources. One of the things going on right now is that we're all in this state of flux and we don't know what it's going to be like even in a week, in 2 weeks. So you don't really know exactly what your time availability really is. If you're still in that fear zone, you might have, additional time back in your day, but are you able to use that time appropriately? Are you going to really absorb something from a learning experience if you're in a state that isn't really optimal for learning? So something that you can do is to tailor your actual learning goals to your needs. So again, if you're still in that early stage of that fear zone, if you're like, well, maybe if I felt better, I'd be able to take on this certification I've been wanting to do. Maybe the first step is finding a mindfulness course or some sort of, wellness mental health program. There's a lot of apps right now that are geared towards helping you with mental health and mindfulness. So maybe doing that first and taking care of that intrapersonal need would make you more successful and set you up to be better at pursuing something like a project management certification.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's about balancing the idea that we have this time right now, but we also don't have this time in this context that's really optimal for learning. So it is a good time right now to do something like to take advantage of online platforms. I know Simplilearn has several courses that you can take with a variety of topics. It's a great time, when you're ready for that, to pursue a professional certification in your field or perhaps in one that you're trying to enter. For my own team with HR, we have several options for HR certifications, and so we've been looking at, is there a way for us right now to take advantage of the fact that maybe we could find a prep course that we can all do kind of together, and then take the certification sometime down the line.
I would like to mention, by the way, Simplilearn is offering a number of its basic courses for free at this time. So you can find out more about that. And I think that's a good way to get into the right headspace for learning.
Absolutely. If there's anything people can take advantage of that's like a free trial or take a course for free, when you can really evaluate if a platform is right for you and if the content is geared towards what you need it to be geared towards, it is a great time, especially when it's something that you can do kind of with no risk, right? To really look into if it's the right thing for you. I know that being able to take advantage of free courses is not something that we have the opportunity to do every day. And so there is this sense of, you want to look at this as a unique opportunity to maybe have access to things you wouldn't normally have access to. That being said, it is definitely not a good time to do something like enroll in a multi-year degree program. I used to work with students who were going into a lot of doctoral programs. And the biggest thing is to really understand what that entails, the amount of time, not just right now, but for the next several years that you're being asked to look at. And so something where you don't know, a year from now what your schedule would be like, it's probably not the time to call up, the university of wherever and see about pursuing that EDD or that PhD. And it's also not a good time, in that vein, to take on more than you can reasonably handle. You want to understand that you're probably not functioning at 100%. Some of us maybe, if we haven't really been disrupted that much, if we were already working pretty remote, if everyone we know is in pretty good health and we're in a calm kind of place, you might be functioning really, really well. But for a lot of us, there's a level of stress we're not used to. And so really being reasonable with yourself and not taking on more than you're going to be able to be successful at, that's going to stop you from things like feeling a sense of failure. We don't need to make ourselves more stressed out right now.
Great advice.
Okay.
So this is going to end at some point, this um, self-isolation due to the virus. But we're going to be feeling impacts from it, for years to come. And what do you see as those long-term impacts on work and careers?
Sure. I think the number one thing that we're seeing right now, and you even see that within the things people share on like social media platforms, is this idea that remote work has gained a new sense of credence. People are seeing that these jobs that we were previously told, well, it's not really as effective if someone is remote in this position, that might not be true. In our own department, we've discussed expanding work from home options after self-isolation ends. I currently our department allows everyone to work one day from home if they want to, and we've already talked about upping that to 2 or even 3 days depending on the position someone's in. And that's going to be so vital to things like retention, even recruitment. If I can say, well, you only have to, that offers flexibility, that expands our reach. People who may not have thought about working at Stanford because maybe it's away. If you only have to commute 2 days a week, or if we can offer a 100% remote position, that's going to be huge to opening up that pool of talent, which also means for everyone that wants to be in that pool of talent, that being able to work remotely is going to be an extremely essential skill. If you're learning to be an effective remote employee now, future into an interview, and you can say, well, during this time I was able to master skills in X, Y, and Z. I was able to demonstrate effective self-directed and self-disciplined learning. I gained this credential that I pursued. These are huge things. Employers will look at this and say, wow, this is someone who even under the worst circumstances was really able to be agile and flexible in how they prepared themselves moving forward for the future. We're also seeing this question of who is essential, and it's such a hard term to use when you're talking about people, but we're looking at what are the roles that are essential to an organization. We had to halt a lot of our laboratory research in our department for at least a little while, and so several people that were highly skilled technicians have had very little work to do. And so you want to think about things like, what are the industries that are thriving, and which positions did we see were first to go? One of the biggest things for me as a human resources manager and as someone who does a lot of career development coaching and advising people on how to, become more attractive candidates when they're searching for careers, the idea of versatility and flexibility. If anyone's ever been in a situation where there was a workforce reduction and suddenly you were asked to take on a new set of tasks or responsibilities, you often see that the people who are most versatile and flexible are the ones that thrive in those situations. I went through a layoff once in an organization I was in several years ago, and I was brand new to the department I was in, and the rest of the team was laid off, and I was not, because I'd already demonstrated very quickly how versatile I was and how quickly I would be able to pick up new skills and really make a difference within the work. So you want to look at how you can expand your existing skill set and learn how to translate those existing skills into new roles. You don't have to have, experience in a direct realm to be able to be an effective employee. I had never been in human resources prior to my current job at Stanford, and it was really a really excellent fit for the experience and skills that I did bring from other work experiences. So you want to be able to really speak to how you can take the skills you already have and translate those into new roles to allow you to be the most versatile possible employee moving forward.
Great. So we're almost at the Q&A section of the webinar, but before that, I'd like to ask one last set of questions for our audience. And this is, what digital skills are you most interested in learning? So on the point that Miriam made of versatility and flexibility and having a broad repertoire, where do you think you personally would want to add to your bag of tricks, so to speak? And I'll give you about 30 more seconds or so to get your answers in. And of course, this is one of those where you can put more than one answer. So about 10 seconds to hit submit. And then we'll So consistent with what we were talking about before, or your responses before, project management's a very popular choice, and a number of you said you were project managers, so that's not surprising at all. Let's move on to the Q&A portion of the webinar, Miriam, and we have a couple of very, very good questions from the audience. First, I want to touch on what are some ways managers can support their direct reports during this transition? Talked about teaming and team leadership, and that seems important to the audience.
Yeah, I think, I spoke to this a little bit earlier, but really setting an example and being a good role model for your team is important. And so, not telling them that they need to, take breaks and have boundaries and then not be respecting that, texting them after hours when you told them to maintain boundaries. And I think that one thing that I took from my experience as an academic advisor, and I've used with some of the managers that I work with, is this idea of something we used to call intrusive counseling, but I'm calling it intrusive management. And what that means, we don't wait for someone to tell us they're having a problem. We are more proactive in reaching out and saying, hey, how's everyone doing? How's your mental health? what do you need from me? Is there anything that's going on right now, work related, that, is you're not able to complete, that you're not able to manage? I had someone call me a couple weeks ago, someone I work with who's pretty young. This is one of his first jobs. And he was reaching out basically just to ask how he could talk to his manager about feeling overwhelmed. He didn't really know how to phrase it. He didn't really know how to express what was going on with him without sounding like, he was, as he thought, sounding like he was complaining. And we discussed how it's important to really, be aware of your needs and make those known. But then I also spoke with his manager, who I knew would be open to him, coming to her, just to ensure that she knew that it might be helpful for her team to be more proactive, to be more intrusive, to ask more often if people are needing to take time for themselves, and to really be very mindful about the difference between what people are able to manage, what kind of bandwidth, so to speak, people have right now because of what's going on in the outside world, having to balance that with the work we're asking them to do.
Uh-huh. Thank you. That's a good reminder for us all. Here's a question from somebody who would like to move out of the fear zone. And the direct question is how to overcome the fear of the future in terms of global recessional impact due to COVID-19.
Yeah, I think that, the hardest thing right now is the unknown, and the level of unknown that we're all facing is really a magnitude that, again, I don't know that many of us have experienced. I know that there's, recessions a decade or so ago, there's been wars, there's different things going on in different countries and regions, but this is kind of a different thing we're facing. And so, the short answer is I don't have a good answer on how to move out of the fear zone, but I do have the answer that you need to attend to your needs. You need to be mindful of how you're feeling. You need to not just, think that repressing or suppressing how you feel is what's going to help. You have to kind of honor those feelings. And so, for me, I share with everyone that I know, I go to therapy. I have a therapist, and I see them weekly via video chat right now, and that's tremendously helpful. And so mental health care is really something that is an option that for some people, when you're really in a space, that's very fearful, can be helpful, because if you're experiencing symptoms, if you're having panic attacks, things like that, that's at a level that, similar to as you would need physiological care from a doctor, you want to try to get care from a professional if you can. Some other things, though, are, the simple things like trying to connect with other people, even doing something you enjoy. If you like taking a walk, if you like reading, if there's art that you enjoy. The other day, they were streaming the Phantom of the Opera, a really wonderful performance of that over the weekend as part of a project that Andrew Lloyd Webber's doing. And so I watched it, and it was really a nice little couple-hour escape, reminding yourself that it's okay to be scared right now, but that also everyone's kind of feeling that, and that as a global society, we're going to pull through this together. It's going to impact people differently. It's going to look different in different places, but we're all experiencing this together. It's a really radical time, and trying to maintain focus on the fact that each day is going to be different, and that the future, it's still there. The future is still there right now, and that's what we have to think about.
Yeah, in the sense that um, you have to have confidence that life goes on, even though there are going to be stressors and obstacles that we generally have overcome all of them to get to where we are now. So we have hope that we can do that in the future.
Right. And it is one thing to be aware of, that we are kind of having to reevaluate some parts of humanity that a lot of us maybe haven't considered before. The whole idea of what is the purpose of what I do, what is the meaning to, the choices I've made in my life. That can be a very, existential thing to consider for some people, and it can feel overwhelming. But for me, it does help a little bit to know that I'm in that place with kind of the rest of the world right now. None of us know what's going to happen. And so
Yeah.
there's almost like affiliation there.
Um, some people have the choice of deciding whether to work from home or whether to continue to go into the office or workplace. And so one question we got was, what are the top questions to ask yourself when deciding to work from home?
Yeah, I think that for me, the top question for everyone in my department, myself included, is what is the risk that I might take by going into the office? And what I mean by that is that for some people, for myself, for example, yesterday when I went into my own office, the risk was very low. I work in a medical clinic building. They're screening everyone who comes in. It's reduced staffing, it's reduced patients. I encountered very few people. Everyone was in masks. They gave us hand sanitizer. It was fine for me to go in and pick something up. That being said, the tech staff that have to work in the labs, where they're very sometimes in close quarters with each other, some of the experiments that aren't vital to someone living or dying, we've put those on hold because we realize that the risk of someone getting sick from this and potentially, the outbreak potential, things like that, outweighed the benefit of people going into work at this time. So you want to ask yourself, what's the risk? If you're at a higher immune risk or something like that, or you live with people who are, that might not be a good idea. You want to ask, what are the consequences of me not going into work? I don't love that we're in a situation for some of us where we have to think about our health versus our economic well-being. But if you're able to, go into work safely, and that's the only way for you to maintain your job, taking as much precaution as possible. But in reality, again, I think it falls to a lot of leadership to really set the tone and the expectation that at the end of the day, I was thinking, I lost a colleague a few years ago. He died one weekend of meningitis. So it was very sudden, very unexpected. It was at a former workplace. And I always think about the day that we all found out he had passed away and the magnitude of what happened and all of us sitting in the same room together, just not speaking and holding that. And I think about how I would live with myself if I told someone they have to go into a workplace for something that truly could be done at home or isn't essential, and that person got sick. And so it's so hard again to have to look at, are we going to balance our actual like health and safety with our economic well-being? But you really want to look at what the risk kind of benefit comparison is. And of course, if you have to go in anywhere, you want to take as much precaution as possible, washing hands, using any protective gear that you may need depending on what your role is. I had my mask on all day yesterday when I was at work, picking up documents, and just really being mindful of how you're engaging when you're out in the spaces.
Great. Um, Here's a great question, which is, what are practical models you can use? What are practical models that I can use? Questioner asks, in prioritization of doing my daily tasks in light of this present crisis.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know for us, a lot of things have shifted because we instituted a hiring freeze. And so one of my team went from being 100% spending her time on recruiting to now having to do some different activities and support different processes. With prioritizing, in my work, I always look at first, of course, if there's like hard deadlines for things. For example, we have payroll deadlines every pay period where we cannot miss our payroll deadlines. That has to be a priority on those days. We have other activities that have deadlines where someone's actual employment will be impacted if we don't turn things in. So I also prioritize based on what the potential outcome may be. Sometimes there's something, someone's been asking me a question that's very, very, low level. She just wants to know if a certain course she can take would be approved for her professional development funds. And so, I prioritize that to the end of my day because I don't need to answer that email right away. There's not a severe outcome for that one. But when I get messages about, hey, I have so-and-so here and they don't have a medical badge to get into the hospital building and they've been called in for surgery, those are the things you prioritize. So really looking at what are your deadlines, especially external ones with serious repercussions, and then what are the consequences to if you don't accomplish a task, what can be deprioritized based on I don't need to do this right now because it's not time bound, it's just a general inquiry. And then of course, looking at what are your resources, what can you do quickly, what can you delegate to other people, but you really want to think about what's actually going on and what's important right now. So for us in human resources, it's making sure people stay paid and stay in benefit status. We've had to deprioritize a couple of the other things like, employee fun engagement days, but really looking at what is the need right now.
Great. One last question. What types of books can we read at this time to help our mental health?
That's a great question. There's so many books and resources out there. I don't, off the top of my head, necessarily have a list, but the topics that I would say that are the most beneficial to be looking at: topics on mindfulness, topics on emotional intelligence, topics on interpersonal and intrapersonal effectiveness. Those are some really great topics to be looking at. For people who are more sensitive or more introverted, there's a couple good books out there about those kinds of aspects. And so there's one, I think it's called Quiet, and it's about introversion. There's another called Highly Sensitive People, I think, and that's something interesting. If you're finding yourself really, in that place where you're realizing this is affecting you a lot more than other people, or at least seems that way, you might be a more highly sensitive person than you realize. And there's a whole set of traits that go along with that. So, again, mindfulness, emotional intelligence, those are some really great topics to be looking at. And there's not just books out there, there's also apps. There's like Calm, I think, is one of them. You can really look at, there's activities you can do. There's very easy, simple, meditations you can do, even to just take these breaks for your brain and to really train your brain to be more attuned to itself and to your needs, and to then respond appropriately.
That's wonderful advice. Last question.
Mhm.
Uh, how to manage information overload? People
Oh,
are now getting bombarded with offers to do webinars, and they maintain their Facebook lives, which are becoming more intense as people spend more time. Web meetings, all the different demands on time, and what's the best thing we need to learn during this time of adversity?
yeah, I think that for information overload, and especially for people who also tend to do that in their personal lives, like if you're a Facebook scroller, you have to practice a real kind of self-discipline. You want to almost approach it like you have an addiction. You want to think about, what is this doing for me? Why am I doing this? What is the emotional response that I'm getting if, I'm sharing information, or if I'm reading every single thing? For those people who are just getting so many emails and invitations and asked to do so many things, um, you know, allow yourself to not do everything. Sometimes it's okay to say no to something. If someone asks you, "Hey, can you, do this webinar?" and you really can't, it's a time where people understand, I think, a lot more than at usual, that not everyone's going to be available for things. I know for our own department, one of the things we have, unfortunately, is Stanford sends so many updates and emails about the health side of things, the business side of things. It feels really overwhelming. And so we've, kind of instituted within the department that we're not going to send our own, massive amounts of emails. We're going to have one succinct summary email each week. We're going to hold a town hall that's optional if people want to get that information kind of verbatim and live, and really just being very disciplined with yourself and taking steps away. I've had to say I'm not going to use my Facebook during certain times. On my lunch break, when I step outside and eat on my patio, I don't bring my phone out, because I have to self-regulate the information that I'm taking in my personal time, because I can't always be as in control of that in my work time. You don't have to read every single email. You can talk to your organizations about really being mindful about things like, marking an email as urgent if it really is urgent, but otherwise, letting people know that not everything has to be attuned or paid attention to at the same time. But it's a two-way street. It's both maintaining a regulation for yourself on what you're taking in, and then again, if you're in a position of leadership, being very mindful about the amount of information that you're putting out there to your organization to not add to that overwhelm.
Great. Well, thank you, Miriam. This has been a wonderful conversation, and that's all the time we have for questions. So,
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And anyone feels like they'd like to look me up on LinkedIn, please feel free. But yeah, thank you to Simplilearn for the invitation.
yeah, and this has been the first of our Teaching Thursdays series of webinars. We're going to be doing them at the same time on Thursdays for at least the next several weeks. And next week's April 30th edition, How Self-Isolation Impacts Team Management, with Jeff Allen. On May 7, we'll be looking at how it affects data science work. And on May 15th, how it impacts a digital marketing career. So we hope that you'll all join us for those editions of Teaching Thursdays as well. And please connect with us on Simplilearn. You can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn. Thanks again all for joining us today. And this is the time that I'd like to ask all of our attendees to exit the webinar, and please answer the poll when you do, or the survey when you do. Thank you again.